So far we've covered quite a lot, but when you write code, you need to be able to break it up into different files. If we were to write everything in one file, things would start to get really messy. So let's start by seeing how this works, and then we'll talk about some of the useful ways that we can break files up just to structure your projects a little bit better. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is create an entirely new file. We'll just use this as an example. It will be very basic, but we'll see what we can do later with functions. So I'm going to call this hello.php. So I'm just creating it alongside the index.php file that we've been working on. Now over in hello.php, what I can do is go ahead and do anything in here and then include that file into here to reuse anything. Now, just as a simple example, let's go ahead and echo out hello. Now, obviously at the moment over on index.php, if we just run this in the browser, we're not going to see anything. But what we can do here is either use the include or the require keyword to pull this file into the current file. So let's just go ahead and include hello.php. So we just give the full path to the name. If this was in another folder, we would just do something like, say it was in a functions folder, we would just do this and separate it by a /. Okay, so now that we've got this included in here, let's refresh the index page and see what happens. And you can see that we see hello. So like I said, we can do pretty much the same thing with require here. There are subtle differences and we're going to speak about that in a minute. And let's go ahead and refresh and see that we get the same result. So the two differences between these is if there was an error in the file that you were creating or if the file couldn't be found, your code would actually stop executing at this point. So to prove this, what we can do is here echo out the rest of our code, and we can go ahead and we can require in a file that doesn't exist. So for example, goodbye.php. Now if I refresh here, you'll see that we see our warning, we see our fatal error because it can't find that file. Now, if I were to go ahead and run include or use include instead, you can see that we see that output just down there. So what I would always do, my recommendation would always use require, because really typically you don't want the rest of your code to run if you are trying to require in a file. If you're requiring in a file, it's more than likely that you're going to actually need that file. So another variation to require and include is something called require once and also include once. And again, there are subtle differences between these as well. So let's do an include once on hello.php and we'll go ahead and see what we get. And we see hello, and it's exactly the same thing with require once as well. And you'll see these used in different places. You might see require used, you might see include or require once. Really, it's not that big a deal, but we're going to look at the difference between require and include once now. Now, if we were to use, say, include twice, then we can imagine that we see hello output twice. Now, the difference between include once and require once is the include and the require part stay the same. So if we require something that doesn't exist, or we do a require once on something that doesn't exist, or we have an error, the rest of the code won't be executed. However, once we append once, what this will do is it will only include this once, however many times we output it. So just to recap then, we have require, which will stop the execution of a script if there's a problem. We have include, which will include a file, but it won't stop the execution of a script. We have include once, which will silently not include a file if it's already been included, and this won't stop the execution if there is a problem. And we have require once, which will stop the execution of the script if there's a problem, and it will prevent the same file from being required in more than once. So with all that said, my recommendation would be to use either require or require once. It's highly unlikely that you're going to require the same file in twice by accident, but generally it's a good rule to use require once just to keep things nice and simple. So now really we want to dive into why all of this is useful. Now, when you're writing basic applications, you may want to separate out any functions or large parts of code that maybe set your application up, like defining configuration, and you want to separate that from everything else. You might also only want to require something in on a particular condition, perhaps within an if statement. So let's take a look at including in a function. And this is definitely something you'd want to include in another file because it makes it reusable within multiple files. So I'm going to delete hello.php and we're going to create a new folder called functions. And then inside of here, I'm going to create a new file called maybe user.php. Really, it depends on how you are structuring your project and of course what you're building. But let's say we had a set of functions that related to a particular user. Okay, so we're going to bring back once again that full name function. So let's go ahead and define this out in our user.php file. So full name. And remember, we include in the first name here. And let's just keep this really simple because we've seen this a million times before. Let's go ahead and return the first name, and let's go ahead and return the last name in there as well. So we now have a function. It's in one file. We can now reuse this within multiple files by requiring it in. So let's say we had an index.php file. Let's imagine this showed a list of users. And then we also had another file, which was maybe a users.php file, which listed out a list of users that you have on your website. Two different files that perhaps want to use this same function. Okay, so within here then, we can go ahead and we can either do a require once, or an include. This time we're inside of a folder. So we're going to say functions/user.php. And what we can now do is we can echo out full name and we can go ahead and pass a name in. So we can just use it as we've seen before. So now over on the index file that we've been working in, we see this, but now over on users, we want to use that same function. Rather than defining that function out again and again and again, we just require it in. It's as simple as that. So we can pretty much do the same thing on here like so. Now, if we come over to users.php, we get exactly the same result. So when you start to get into something like object-oriented programming, you'll find that you won't need to require lots of files in. Instead, you'll use something called auto-loading. Now, we're not quite that far ahead yet, but keep it in your mind and you'll see how that works if you decide to move on to object-oriented programming and the course we have on Codecourse. Either way, we've looked at require, we've looked at include, and these are still very useful and you'll most likely use them in every project that you build.